Hi, hello, welcome to my review of this new Hunger Games movie, The Hunger Games, The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes. This is the new Hunger Games movie directed by Francis Lawrence. He already directed 3 of the 4 Hunger Games movies that came before, which are part 2, 3, and 4. Even though there is not a single perfect Hunger Games movie, I have to say that Hunger Games is one of the most consistent and one of the best film series in general. A series about a dystopian world. It's very consistent. It tells a very coherent story from the first minute to the last. It feels like it was very planned out, and yeah, it's definitely one of my favorite film series in general. The last Hunger Games movie came out in 2014. And not quite 10 years later, they made this movie, which is a prequel basically. It's about a young Coriolanus Snow, who is the president in the film series of Hunger Games, and it takes place about 50 years earlier during the 10th annual Hunger Games. And it's basically about him who comes from a very poor family, but he wants to go to university, and to go to university, everyone who wants to do that has to basically prove that they are worth it. And so what they have to do is they have to train one tribute who has to go to the annual Hunger Games. Coriolanus Snow is played by Tom Blythe, and Rachel Zegler plays the tribute who he has to train, who is called Lucy Gray. I didn't write down her last name, but she's called Lucy Gray. This movie, by the way, has very, very good ratings, which I really try to stay away from the ratings with this movie because I was anticipating it so much. And so when I saw that it had a very high rating, or at least relatively high rating on IMDb, I was quite surprised, I have to say. It's about as well rated as the other Hunger Games movies, and on Letterboxd it's actually the highest rated Hunger Games movie. It has a 3.8 rating. I have to say I don't quite get it because I didn't really like this movie a lot. Also in general, the consensus about this movie seems to be pretty good, so there must be something that I am missing, because also none of the people who I watched this movie with, they also really didn't like it. So it's a very select group of people who didn't really like this movie, but everyone else seems to really enjoy it. But I have to praise some things about this movie definitely, because this movie is not completely horrible in any way. First of all, I have to praise the look of this movie. For example, they used very wide lenses so that the whole movie looks very epic and very grand. For example, also the Hunger Games sequences itself, there are some fights in this movie that are filmed in such an epic way. But also in general, I have to say that the whole environment of this movie, all the backgrounds really felt real. It felt like the Hunger Games world, which is a big praise. And I have to say that this movie actually manages to have a lot of environments that are probably VFX, but I didn't notice it. With a lot of movies this year, I really noticed when a lot of things were CGI. It feels like the biggest blockbusters this year were really not that consistent with VFX, but this movie does it really good. I don't think there's a very bad looking shot for the most part. And that's also great because in combination with the great world building, I have to say I was feeling very immersed into the world in general, because I was actually pretty interested in what the capital, or in general the whole country of whatever this country is called, looked like in the past. And I have to say they did a very good job. I also really like the way that the Hunger Games are really not that fleshed out yet. Even though it's the 10th annual Hunger Games already, it's not really like perfectly figured out, and also in general all the districts are looking a lot different from what they looked like in the Hunger Games movies. So yeah, I really enjoyed that part about it. And I also have to say that the acting is really good. Tom Blythe is definitely very good in this movie, because I feel like this character was not very easy to portray. He has a lot of different emotions. I feel like there's a lot of things going inside his head, because he's a very conflicted person about a lot of things. And so I think his portrayal of this character was really good. I also have to say that Rachel Zegler was very good. She plays a character who is very over the top, it feels like, very loud and very extroverted, and she was on the border of being annoying, but I think she did it well enough so that I was not annoyed with her, even though she was a very loud personality in this film. And also someone I really didn't expect in this movie was the predecessor of Caesar Flickerman, who's called Lucky Flickerman. He's played by Jason Schwartzman, and he is actually like very standout in this movie. He has a lot of very funny sequences. I think he's like very good comic relief in this film who is not annoying. He has a lot of good humor. Comedic timing is really perfect in this film. The movie in general is separated into 3 parts, and I do have to say that these parts continually get worse over time, which was really disappointing to see, because the first part is actually really good. I really just liked the whole introduction to this whole movie, to the characters. I really was interested in all the characters, and I also think that in general just seeing how the beginnings of the Hunger Games look was quite interesting to see, because even though Snow didn't have the power that he has in the Hunger Games movies, at the point of this film. He still has a lot of influence on the Hunger Games in a way that we didn't know before, which I thought was really cool to see. But with part 2, I have to say it's actually going downhill very quickly. It's at this point where the movie feels like it's trying to be way too many things at once and doesn't really handle it very well. It's basically the Hunger Games part of the movie, which I realized that this was not going to be the only thing about this film. I realized that the highlight of this film is not going to be the Hunger Games themselves, because that would be pretty boring. It's about Jon Snow. It's about Snow, and not the Hunger Games themselves. So I get that they wouldn't try to make this Hunger Games sequence as epic as it was in the first and the second Hunger Games. But I do have to say that that also really took away from the intensity of the Hunger Games, because it's still a fight for death, especially for one of our main characters, Lucy Gray. She is like a person we have to care for, and the fact that she is in a battle of life and death should be a little bit more frightening than it was in this film. Even though some of the battles were intense, I still didn't really care for it, because there's always this cutting back and forth between the environment that Snow was in, where everybody's basically just watching the games, and inside the arena. One thing that I kind of thought was missing about the Hunger Games movies themselves was the fact that we didn't really see a lot how the Hunger Games look from the outside. I was really interested in how they would look from the outside and how just a normal viewer would view the Hunger Games. So that was basically a little bit more important in this one. But still, the fact that they cut out of the arena so much really made me care less for this plotline, and or for both plotlines. And also there was so much comedic relief with Lucky Flickerman that even though it was really funny, it really took away from the intensity of the battle, which I just didn't want. And also some characters were, like for example Viola Davis's character, who is really just annoying and way too much. I really didn't enjoy her in the film. And also the Hunger Games are just like getting way too much in a way that's just too out there. I really thought that, for example, Catching Fire, the second Hunger Games movie, was my least favorite, because it feels like the second part of this movie, which is basically just Hunger Games, is just way too much. I really liked the simplicity of the Hunger Games in the first Hunger Games movie, and then the second one, it was just too much. There were monkeys, and then it was gas, and then we had blood rain and whatever. They just like overdid it a little, and it feels like that's the case with this one too, in a way that makes sense, because the Hunger Games are not as fleshed out yet. But also after 10 annual Hunger Games, it feels like they should have figured it out a lot more. Just to see an arena that is completely broken, and to have these drones, for example, be like completely malfunctioning, and that they would never really try to fix it, or the thing with the snakes, it just isn't really that interesting, and really takes away from the believability of these games. And then we get to part 3, which is really just a mess. It's about the aftermath of the Hunger Games, and about what happens to Snow and Rachel. I'm constantly saying Rachel and Lucy Gray in this movie. So it's telling the downfall in character, but the uprising of the power of Snow in a very messy way, because it basically tries to tell a lot more than it should in this little runtime. There's this weird side plot with some fugitives that is kind of important to the main plot, but it just comes out of nowhere in a way, and it's also like, I can't really explain that how weird it is, but it just feels very out of place in the story. There's also a conflict basically that grows between Lucy Gray and Snow, and even though the conflict makes sense in its concept, I have to say it was very rushed and also very easily resolved. It feels like there should have been a lot more to this, but it's just a conflict that is mentioned, and then they have like this conflict, and then it's over, and we never really get to hear anything from it, which might make sense a lot more if you watch the movie and just don't just hear me explaining. But it was something that I really thought was missing to this movie. Like, there was such a long runtime, 2.5 hours, and we still didn't get this storyline, this important storyline of two main characters in this movie resolved. Also, there's way too much singing in this part of the movie. Lucy Gray is a singer, and it's part of her character that she sings, but it's just, it gets to the point where it really is just annoying. Also, part of her character is that she's very loud, as I already said, and she can very seem like she doesn't really care about things that she obviously cares about. But one thing that I have to say that really just felt out of place was the fact that she didn't really care about the fact that she was in the Hunger Games. She won the Hunger Games, so she witnessed the death of 23 kids of her age and younger than her. There were a lot of kids with disabilities in this battle, and it feels like a character who is as nice and open as Lucy should be caring a lot more about the fact that she witnessed the death of all of these people. But she doesn't really at all. Like, it's just never mentioned again. It feels like the fact that she was in the Hunger Games was just such a side plot that was just something that they wanted to get over with and then just not mention again ever. And without spoiling anything, it feels like that's her whole character as well. They had this character who was very important to the plot because she's the main character, but everything that happens with her is seemingly just an afterthought in this movie. Because when it's not Snow anymore that you can like care about in this film, it is her. And so when she's just kind of not that important anymore, I don't really have a reason to care for this movie anymore. And also they really filled this movie a lot with Hunger Games references that were unnecessary. For example, the title song of the third Hunger Games movie, which is iconic at this point and it's great. And it's kind of like with 28 Days Later when they had this final song in the House on a Heartbeat that was used in the final sequence of the movie, and because it was so great they thought it would be like so great as well to use it a lot more in the sequel, which took away from the effect and from the intensity of the song a lot. And that's basically the same thing in this one. They just overused the song, and they also had a name reference of Katniss herself. They also had a reference with these mockingjays, which were just not needed in this movie at all. All these factors really just made me less interested in the movie the longer it went, and at some point the movie just completely left me. The movie is not horrible. It definitely had a lot of great things, and that's why I wouldn't rate this movie like completely low. It's not a horrible film. It's just that it's rushed, it is inconsistent, and it feels like this movie should have been two movies. I don't know if I would care about the story if it was two movies, but I can definitely say that they would have probably been able to take much more time with the story than they had with this film. And so I'll give this movie a 4.5 out of 10. It's disappointing, definitely. But I guess a lot of people were very happy about this film because, again, it's the best rated Hunger Games movie on Letterboxd. I don't know how this happened, but it happened. If you are interested in this movie, I will not hold you back. But just be prepared for disappointment, I guess, because it's not the most consistent movie that has come out this year or in the Hunger Games franchise in general. It's definitely the worst Hunger Games movie thus far. What can you do? Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.